Hello, everyone. This is a NewsNation live stream. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mike Viqueira. I'm the bureau chief for NewsNation here in Washington, D.C. and in Washington just moments ago. President Biden addressing reporters and the nation from the East Room of the White House, giving us an update on the situation in Ukraine and the United States and its allies' reaction after Vladimir Putin has now sent his military over the border in eastern Ukraine into those disputed regions known as Donetsk and Luhansk, areas that have been held by pro-Russian forces over the last 8 years. But President Biden, with some very stark warnings in reaction to that, it does not, in short, think that Vladimir Putin is going to stop there. The president says that he does expect Vladimir Putin to send his forces deeper into Ukraine. He says that the speeches that President Putin has given over the course of the last 24 to 48 hours set up a rationale for Russian forces to go much further. President Biden, also notably announcing a new set of sanctions in reaction to what we've seen over the course of the last 12 hours as those Russian forces do spill into Ukraine. These sanctions that the White House has been touting for weeks, if not months now, as the toughest ever imposed, measures that don't bring the full weight of those sanction regimes onto Russia immediately, sort of waiting to see just how much further he goes. But these sanctions that the president announced today, very significant. Full blocking sanctions, he says, on a big Russian bank known as VBE and the military bank that funds Russian operations, the military bank from which the Russian army and Russian military draws funds. A cutoff from Western finances, President Biden says. It remains to be seen just how extensive that is, but if, in fact, President Biden means to say Russia will no longer have access to Western banks and financial systems, something that had been on the table and speculated a lot about over the course of the last several weeks, that would be very significant. Starting tomorrow, says President Biden, there will be sanctions on the so-called elites and oligarchs in Russia, many of them close friends and close supporters of Vladimir Putin. This would represent, I guess the translation in American politics would be the base of Vladimir Putin's support, and part of the aim here on the part of the United States and its allies in imposing the sanctions on these elites is to try to undercut that support that Vladimir Putin has domestically. His power now seems to be something close to total over the military and domestic politics in Russia itself. Nord Stream 2, that pipeline that's been completed but is not yet flowing, there's not yet natural gas flowing from Russia to Germany and into Western Europe. A lot of discussion around that over the course of the last several weeks. You know that Germany yesterday announced that Nord Stream 2, the approval process, which is still in process, is going to be suspended. President Biden reiterating that today as well. He says that more U.S. forces, there are currently about 9,000 U.S. forces, not in Ukraine, of course, but in NATO and U.S. allies that border Russia and Ukraine, namely Poland, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Romania. The president says he's going to be sending yet more troops there. We've seen deployments now from Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Campbell in Kentucky, and elsewhere around the United States. Twofold reasons here. To reassure those Eastern European allies that the United States stands foursquare behind them should there be a spillover of a conflict from Ukraine between Russian and Ukrainian forces into those countries, and also to help the refugee flows that are inevitably going to be coming out of Ukraine and into Poland, Romania in particular. The president says he's trying to target the Russian economy, not American consumers. Of course, this is a very big concern. Russia is a major oil producer around the world. I think it's about a tenth of the world's oil supply. That all now in jeopardy, not to mention the natural gas pipeline that we mentioned. Russia, very much a major supplier of Western Europe and the world in general. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline now suspended. So President Biden wants to be careful to say that this is not going to impact American consumers in terms of pain at the pump or energy costs for heating your home or air conditioning your home as the summer approaches. It remains to be seen, however, what the impact is going to be. So, in short, President Biden saying President Putin has called into question Ukraine's right to exist and he's taking action now and reserves the right to take further action should Vladimir Putin move further into Ukraine, which President Biden says he expects to happen. Let's move now to a couple of questions that we're getting from some of you. Dale in Hawaii asks, what is the history of the governmental entities in the regions where Russia has moved troops? What do the people in those regions want? That's a great question. And the history of it all probably goes back to, what, the 8th century? So I'm not going to do it all now. I mean, historically, yes. Parts of Ukraine, particularly Kiev, have been capitals of the Russian-speaking world going back centuries. More recently, of course, Ukraine was a province, a republic more specifically, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, which obviously folded in 1991, and that's when Ukraine gained its independence. You know, it's interesting. I saw a study just published today, a poll actually of Ukrainians who said that they have positive feelings towards the Russian people themselves, and that's reciprocated by many Russians. But Vladimir Putin, obviously, over the course of the last several days, has been trying to drum up a rationale for the Russian people to gain support of the Russian people behind this military adventure that he has now apparently initiated. And if it does come to a shooting conflict, which again President Biden says is going to happen, then inevitably there will be losses on both sides. Obviously heavy losses on the Ukrainian side because they're outgunned and outmanned by the Russian army, but Russian losses as well. So part of what President Putin is doing for his people is to prepare them for that. So a great deal of dispute. You heard President Putin in that speech yesterday say that Ukraine basically is part of Russia and always has been. Obviously, the Ukrainians, with a proud history and a distinct history for themselves, would strongly disagree. Let's see. Richard asks, how does the situation in Russia compare with similar past conflicts, such as Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait? You know, it's interesting because I've been thinking about this myself. I guess it's somewhat similar. And when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait and kicked off Desert Storm, in the Bush 41 term, George H.W. Bush 41 term, when we saw, you know, the U.S. military essentially throw Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait but not pursue the Iraqi army into Baghdad and try to depose or overthrow Saddam Hussein. I guess there are very rough analogies there. A lot of people have also been making the analogy to 1938 in Munich, when the British Prime Minister went to Munich to negotiate with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis about portions of what was then Czechoslovakia and an area known as the Sudetenland. And of course, an infamous moment in 20th century history was when the British Prime Minister came back to England, held up a piece of paper after striking a deal with Hitler and said, "Peace in our time," because he essentially ceded this area of Czechoslovakia to Germany. Well, as we know, it didn't work out that way. Hitler invaded Poland, he invaded Czechoslovakia, and he invaded France, among other places. So, you know, that's part of the antecedent here. That's part of the history here. That's, you know, there aren't a lot of people who are alive that have first-hand memories of that. But certainly the legacy of that, we're still feeling the repercussions, and we are still living under a world order that was formed after World War II that was a result of that conflict. So there are, you know, there are antecedents, there are parallels, there are attachments to that portion of history, certainly. And that's part of the rationale. You know, the Eastern Europeans along the border, who are now NATO members in particular, have very fresh memories, much fresher memories of domination by Russia, and in particular the Soviet Union, but of Moscow, which was the capital of the Soviet Union. They don't want that to happen again. Even portions of Poland and parts of Eastern Europe that have had a conservative ascendancy in politics lately, they don't want to see that happen again, by and large. And so there is a somewhat united front in these countries to try to fight back now to what Vladimir Putin is doing. So it's a very interesting question. We could talk about the history for a while, and it really is fascinating. Another viewer asked, could the UN offer to send peacekeeping troops to take the place of Russian troops? They could. I think they'd probably have a hard time getting the votes for that in the United Nations. I think what this viewer is referencing is the fact that Vladimir Putin has actually characterized the troops he is sending over the border, and remember, he has some 190,000, as many as 190,000 troops, not only on the eastern part near the Donbass, where he's coming into now, but north of Ukraine on the border with Russia, and north of Ukraine on the border with Belarus, and south of Ukraine on the border with in Crimea which of course he annexed back in 2014 as well, which was part of Ukraine. And so would UN peacekeepers go there? I seriously doubt that there would be a consensus in the United Nations to send peacekeepers into such a volatile situation. But I think more importantly, it's sort of an okey-doke, a sucker's game that Vladimir Putin is playing in calling them peacekeepers. They're not really peacekeepers, and Vladimir Putin would have no interest in having any neutral or white-helmeted third party from the UN or elsewhere in there to interfere with what his ultimate aims are. Okay, do we have other questions from folks around the country? So just to recap, okay, here we go. Are Ukrainians more united or willing to fight back against Russia? You know, all we can do is rely on what we've seen, the reporting and the Ukrainians that we've interviewed and the Americans in Ukraine. Keep in mind there are a lot of Americans that are still in Ukraine and don't want to leave. They're living their lives there. It appears that the Ukrainian military is poised to put up a fight. Again, most military experts that you talk to do not think that they would stand much of a chance in fighting an all-out Russian invasion of their country. But if they did put up a fight, it would undoubtedly be a gruesome, grisly affair with hundreds and thousands of casualties and deaths, not only among the combatants, the uniformed combatants, but among the Ukrainian population. So obviously this is something that wants to be avoided, that should be avoided, that everyone wants to avoid. But it's up to really Vladimir Putin and exactly how far he wants to go inside Ukraine. I mean, there's all kinds of speculation about what his ultimate aim here is to destabilize the Ukrainian government. Keep in mind that part of what's driving Vladimir Putin, such as we understand it, to make these moves is that Ukraine has tilted more towards the West over the course of the last several years. Ukraine is looking towards the West for economic interdependency, to join up economically, to benefit economically, but also militarily, and has explored the possibility of becoming a NATO member itself. That is a change from previous Ukrainian regimes over the course of the last couple of decades, and something that represents a failure, a policy failure, a foreign policy failure on the part of Vladimir Putin, and that is something he is trying to rectify now through brute force. And so far we are seeing from President Biden and other Western leaders, Emmanuel Macron in France and Scholz, in the newly installed chancellor in Germany, appear so far to be unified in their willingness to punish Vladimir Putin through the use of sanctions. So a lot of this is developing, obviously, minute by minute. The president says there's going to be more sanctions over the course of the coming days. A lot of it is contingent on how much further Vladimir Putin wants to go into Ukraine. Of course, we did hear President Biden just say that he thinks that Putin is not going to stop in these areas that have been occupied by forces sympathetic to Russia, Russian paramilitary, Russian irregulars in this eastern Ukraine area called the Donbass, where they've been for the last 8 years. I mean, one of the crucial questions leading up to what the president just said was, are the citizens, the body politic in Western Europe and voters here in the United States, are they going to be willing to put up with economic pain in the form of higher energy prices and other things simply to punish Vladimir Putin for moving militarily into an area that was, for all intents and purposes over the last 8 years, already controlled by pro-Russia forces? That's a serious question, but again, the president thinks that he's not stopping there. He's going to continue moving into Ukraine and possibly even to the capital of Kiev. Nikki on Facebook asks, will we send troops in Ukraine since they're not part of NATO? Seems like a very far-fetched scenario, Nikki. The president, on down, every member of the administration, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, it's just unrealistic to think that the United States is going to send in troops into Ukraine to fight Russian forces. There have been small units, American units, the Florida National Guard most recently, on training missions that rotate in and out of Ukraine. They have since been taken out. The idea of what the president himself, President Biden himself, has called World War III, pitting American troops, military, against Russian military in a head-to-head fight over Ukraine, seems like it's very, very improbable at this moment. However, No one knows which way these things go. A massive invasion, there is going to be a lot of collateral damage, and a key question here is, what will the refugee crisis look like, and what will the spillover look like in terms of refugees and military spillover look like? Will there be accidental planes shooting down, accidental military confrontations along the border of these NATO allies like Poland and Romania? And will Vladimir Putin threaten the Baltic states, which were also part of the USSR, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia? These are major questions that are outstanding. The world at a very dangerous precipice today as Vladimir Putin makes this move into eastern Ukraine. I think we're going to have to wrap up now, I think I'm being told. So, folks, thanks very much for joining us. Again, I'm Mike Viqueira with NewsNation. I'm the bureau chief here in Washington, where we've just heard President Biden address the nation on the situation in Ukraine.